So, a couple things to let you know about. First of all, midterm grades have been posted, so you should be able to pull them up. Secondly, with that, that did not include the research paper. The research paper I graded that after I had posted midterm grades. If you have any questions about your grades, you can certainly look them up on Blackboard, and then if you have additional questions, feel free to get in contact with me about that, and I'd be glad to sit down and we can talk about where you are, where you want to go for the rest of the semester. Secondly, I do have the research papers graded, and I returned them to you through Blackboard. You should be able to pull up under your grades a brief little description that I gave of your paper. Most of the papers looked pretty good. Some grammar issues, and I pointed them out in the grading comments. Returned to you a grading rubric, which was a breakdown of how I graded the different sections of your paper. If you have any questions, you're not completely sure why I graded something, why I graded it, by all means get in contact with me. If you would like a copy of your paper with the grammatical issues noted, I'm more willing to supply that to you as well. And so, if you want that kind of detail, let me know. And in general, I know most students, they're wanting to see the grade and how they got graded. They're not as concerned about the specifics. So if you want the specifics, please let me know, and I'll certainly provide you a copy of that. You should be able to, when you pull up the grade, there should be a file attached that is your last name, and it's a docx file, and so you can pull that up, and that will give you the breakdown of the grading. Don't forget to keep up with the reading quizzes. Several more reading quizzes up through the next couple of weeks, so don't forget about them. In the next couple of days, probably at the beginning of next week, I'll have the study guide posted for the final, help you prepare for the final, which is coming up pretty soon as well. But we still have a couple more centuries to get through before we get to that point. And so I want to finish up today with some things related to the 19th century, and specifically looking at aspects of Christian practice, some of the things that were new to Christianity in the 19th century, some of which we've kind of seen some things that are carryovers from previous generations. And that's where we begin with talking about the Second Great Awakening. In the 18th century, we talked about what's often referred to as the Great Awakening. In this time of revivalism, very emotional connections to religion, the rise of evangelicalism, and we talked about people like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, all in the middle of the 18th century. Well, even though a lot of our focus was on kind of the 1730s, 1740s, during that time period, those revivals continue to progress or appear in a variety of ways over the rest of the 1700s. And so into the 1800s, into the 19th century, where we are today, there were scattered moments of revivals. But once we get to the 19th century, we see that, again, intense emotionalism, intense interest in religion, the growth of quite a few groups, some of which we've talked about, some of which we'll mention today. And so there's this kind of immediate flowering in the 19th century, this explosion of religious interest and religious participation. And some people have suggested that some of this is due to the consequences of the Revolution, with the disestablishment of state churches, right, which continues into the 19th century. This interest in religion, instead of being forced to be a Christian of a specific denomination, a lot of people now, a lot of movements competing for people, and led to a variety of people wanting to know more about certain Christian groups. Essentially, this second Great Awakening, the second time of great emotional revival of Christianity, happened in predominantly three places almost simultaneously. The first wave of the second Great Awakening happened out west. And now again, we're talking about the United States. And we're talking about the United States in 1800, 1801, even some periods slightly before that. So the West is like Kentucky, right? It's not the West like we think of it today. We're talking about periods before the Louisiana Purchase, and so we're talking about a United States that essentially stops at the Mississippi River or thereabouts. Now, in the time period of the West, right, Kentucky, Tennessee, is a place that is largely unoccupied by European settlers. There's certainly Native Americans there, but as far as Christian groups, it's an area that's very sparsely settled. There are very few religious communities because people are so spread out. There are relatively few people there. There's also that kind of frontier mentality. People really focus on the land, giving land, modifying land, which led to a lot of violence because there weren't as many structures of society, institutions like governments, churches, other types of institutions that would have led to a civilizing influence. In the West, there were a couple of people that were pretty well responsible for this revival of Christianity. One of them was a man named James McGready. McGready moved to western North Carolina when he was young, was a Presbyterian, had studied theology in Pennsylvania, actually, and had become a minister in the Carolinas towards the end of the 18th century. But eventually he moves to southwestern Kentucky. And over the last part of the 18th century and into the 19th century, at several places throughout Kentucky, his preaching results in these rather large groups having a very emotional response to his preaching, much like what we saw with Whitefield and Edwards in the 17th century. This then involves a revival in a place in Kentucky known as Red River. And in his memoir, he writes about the floor being covered with the slain. Now what he means here is that there's this emotional experience that comes over people while he's preaching. Right? Many of them attributing it to the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Spirit coming upon these people, and they pass out, they fall on the floor. They are slain in the Spirit, as it said. And so the floor was covered by the slain, says McGready, and their screams for mercy pierced the heavens. Now there's this heavily emotional connection to Christianity that's going on. Right? Much more so than what we saw even in the Great Awakening, but surely much more so than we've seen in Christianity before. At another place in Kentucky known as Gaspar River, where McGready was preaching, people came from up to hundreds of miles to Gaspar River for this service. Up to 8,000 people were there, according to some of the reports. Now, 8,000 people might not seem a lot to us today when we can get 10 times that in a football stadium for a Saturday game. But we're talking about a period much more in sort of mass transportation, mass travel. People are scattered about. So this is a sizable group of people to get together in one place in the late 18th, early 19th century. But the major part of all of this in the West is a revival that takes place at Cane Ridge in Kentucky. And to kind of fill in here, we need to pick up the story of a man named Martin Warren Stone. Warren Stone grew up as an Anglican, but through the work of McGready and some others, had converted to Presbyterianism. He eventually decided to be a minister as well. And, having been influenced by McGready, saw a lot of what McGready was doing, and decided to start using some of McGready's methods in the Cane Ridge Church where he is preaching. And gradually, Stone and McGready and others decided they're going to have this large religious gathering there in Cane Ridge. And this occurs in August of 1801. It's estimated that 10 to 20,000 people showed up at this revival at Cane Ridge. Now, at the time, Lexington, Kentucky is the largest city in the state, and it has about 1,800 people. And so this is a sizable group of people coming from all over to participate in this revival. And out of that, there's so much that is certainly religious about this, but there was also a lot of confusion and chaos, too, because in this area here in Cane Ridge, there would be these preaching stands that were set up all over the area. And people would be preaching at various times throughout the day. And so you'd have kind of a cacophony of different preachers. But the other thing to think about as well is that it's, at this point, we talk about Stone and McGree. Both of whom are Presbyterians. But at Cane Ridge, it wasn't just Presbyterian preaching. There were Baptist preachers there. There were Methodist preachers there. And so you have Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian preachers, kind of preaching from these stands. And the people that come are just kind of milling about, moving from one stand to another. Eventually, this would have a significant impact on Stone, especially, because he sees this huge gathering, tens of thousands of people. And they're Baptists, and they're Methodists, and they're Presbyterian. But some of those labels are not as important to this group that's meeting here. And so eventually this leads Stone to say, maybe what we need to do is get rid of some of these denominational labels and just be Christians. And so he eventually leaves Presbyterianism and starts a movement where they just call themselves Christians. And out of all of this, his goal is to kind of recreate this ecumenical uniting spirit he saw at Cane Ridge. Eventually, he would unite his movement with the movement of the Campbells, which we talked about before spring break, who were also trying similar things, trying to get back to the apostolic Christianity, trying to get past all the denominational labels, and eventually the Stone movement and the Campbell movement would unite. And so there's this confusion, there's the uniting, the ecumenical outlook, but there's also, again, this heavy emotionalism that's going on. And there was a period of time where it's this kind of very intense emotion that's going on. Now, a lot of the people that would later criticize the meeting at Cane Ridge often looked at the emotionalism in very negative ways and would comment that not all of the emotion that was going on in Cane Ridge was specifically emotion directed toward religious canons. Some people would actually claim that there were more souls created at Cane Ridge than were converted. Now, you might not necessarily catch what I'm saying there, but camp meetings like this would become illegal in some cases because 9 months after the revival, there would be a lot of single mothers. So that it's not just Christianity that's going on. There was often a lot of intense emotional experiences that were unrelated to Christianity. But essentially what we have here is this emphasis on a compressed conversion experience. If you think back to how we talked about with the Puritans and some of these other groups, how they thought about what it meant to become a Christian, what it meant to convert, it would often be this long, drawn-out process over several months, maybe even several years, before you would have that conversion experience. And you'd kind of have to go through this psychological process of recognizing your own guilt and then kind of festering in that for a while before you recognize the grace of God. But here at Cane Ridge, the emphasis was on immediate conversion. It was convert now. You don't need to think about all your guilt, and so you have this compressed conversion experience. You have this very heavily emotional stress of conversion because you got the psychological pressure of everybody out there. But then also emotionalism was expressed in the West, here at places like Cane Ridge, through a variety of actions known as exercises. And so the critics and even the people that supported Cane Ridge talked about the different things that happened during these meetings. People would suddenly start to weep. Well, it kind of makes sense. People would suddenly have these great experiences of joy. And again, it kind of makes sense. Okay, we can see how that would occur in such a situation. But there were people who would suddenly just fall. Maybe we can kind of understand that emotionalism of the moments, hearing about your soul's destiny for hell unless you follow Jesus, and cause people to pass out from intense emotion. But this kind of preaching would often also inspire people to just start running. Right? They felt like they were under such fear that they would try to run away. And so you have these people that would just start running during the sermon, and they would usually pass out. People that would start jerking, start jumping, right? It was almost as if their body was moving of its own accord. People who would start barking. You heard me about barking. Usually in response to the jerks, you would start jerking and you would just kind of come out as a barking type of sound. People that would suddenly start laughing or dancing or even singing. You say, okay, that doesn't fit in with that one. Well, no, the singing, they said, wasn't coming from people's mouths, but was coming from within their chests. They just kind of like coming out of their bodies instead of through their mouths. So there's all these kind of things that are going on. And it was these kind of things that critics of this emotionalism pointed to as, this isn't godly. And so they would say God is a God of order. And so they pull a passage from 1 Corinthians 14 and say, this isn't orderly, so it's not from God. They would say there's too much emphasis on free grace. This idea of people suddenly making a decision for Christ. We're talking about a group of people who are very Calvinistic, who are thinking, you don't have the choice in this matter. Yet here are these preachers telling you have the choice. A lot of these preachers didn't have a lot of education. And so a lot of critics pointed to that and said, here you have these people that don't have any educational standards. And so in some cases, in the West especially, this led to schisms between denominations. Among the Presbyterians, for example, who are kind of the forefront of this in the West. You have, this kind of complaint about, these ministers who haven't been educated. You also have the kind of breaking down of the old right, new right schism from the Great Awakening. And in the Great Awakening, there were those that favored the revivals, known as new rights, and then those that didn't like the revivals, old rights. Well, by the time of the Second Great Awakening, that had relatively healed over. And Presbyterians have been united, but the Second Great Awakening breaks that apart again. And so, while there's this ecumenical outlook for people like Barton W. Stone, for those that don't like the emotionalism, this is causing trouble. This is breaking apart groups instead of bringing groups together. Another thing that comes out in the West is what's known as the camp meeting. And throughout the 19th century, and even you can find it in the 20th century, you have these kind of large gatherings where people will come together for days, sometimes weeks, in an outdoor setting. Right? So they're gathering for these Christian meetings, but they're doing it in the great outdoors. And so they're known as camp meetings. Hundreds of these appeared in the Appalachian region in the early 1800s and into the middle of the 1800s. It was a time of noise and excitement, right? People were very excited about what was going on. We're talking in a time before radio or television, so it was not just a religious opportunity, it was also an entertainment opportunity, a socializing opportunity. And the real winner out of the Second Great Awakening in all of this is not the Presbyterians, but actually the Methodists. And it's the Second Great Awakening that leads to the Methodists becoming the largest denomination in the early 19th century. The because the Methodists, of course, are now developing as a unique separate denomination. Remember, the Wesley's intent in the 18th century, up through the Revolution, was to have just a group within the Anglican Church. Right? Methodism was in Anglicanism. It wasn't a separate group. But it had started to break apart, and especially in the United States, that really takes place after the Revolution because of the connection of the Anglican Church to the crown, to the king. And so Methodism really develops as a separate denomination first in the United States. And they become almost the exclusive users of these camp meetings, right, setting up these periods of time. But they're also using what are known as circuit-riding preachers. Right? Preachers that are not located in a specific church, but have an area where they're responsible for. And so they would travel around that area and minister to different people in different places. In the early 19th century, not too many groups were doing that. Right? They would establish a minister in a church. But the Methodists are using large numbers of ministers, having them travel around, reaching larger numbers of people. And people who might not see another religious leader or religious official for months at a time. And so Methodists are baptizing large numbers of people in the early 19th century. Why were they so successful? Well, a couple of things. First, they were very hierarchical and methodical in their planning. Unlike some other denominations who have hierarchies, there was an intense focus by the Methodist leaders on assigning people to specific areas, requiring reports, having districts and their supervision, and staffing was much greater of a system than other denominations. The use of the camp meeting, right, which brought religious services and experiences to people spread out from society. The fact that Methodists would recruit ministers from common people, right, that they were open to ministers coming from any class of society. And then finally, a very important part out of the Second Great Awakening that was part of the Methodist outlook was an emphasis on kind of this Arminian approach to salvation. That human beings have the choice. Right? There isn't this predestined notion in God's mind that the exact people who will be saved and who will be lost, but that salvation is available to all. And this message, in contrast to the Calvinism of the time, was quite welcome to a lot of people. And so in the West, you have a very, it's kind of outdoorsy, separated from society, very emotional.